I think my task today is simply to invite my colleague Julianne Schultz to moderate this session. Julianne is the Professor of Media and Culture at Griffith University, Chair of the conversation, and she'll moderate the conversation. We will catch questions through the session, and so after the opening remarks have finished, I'll bring those through my email to the table. So, thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And I would like to introduce Martin Parkinson, who is one of the two panellists on this session. This one's going to be slightly different to the rest of the day because it's going to be a sort of just more a discussion between myself, Martin Parkinson, and Professor Tiernan, who is behind the border in Queensland. And while she could have got down, she couldn't have got back. And she's a very loyal Queenslander. That was a price too high to ask. So this will be a slightly different format than we've had so far, and hopefully it will be able to pull together a number of the threads that we've heard today and take some other directions. I would like the other presenters to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Gadigal people of the Eora lands, Eora Nation. And I'd like to just say that in this conversation we're going to be having, which is about how to use the COVID moment as a time for reform, of how to use a crisis, and thinking quite sort of fundamentally about the big issues of governance and public organisation and so on, that I found the Governor's welcome this morning and speaking in language to be profoundly moving. That in this place, at the sort of epicentre of the beginning of colonisation in Australia, that a governor would speak, acknowledging traditional owners, using language, I think is really an important very important signal that we are up for quite big changes in this country, even though we're sort of a bit diffident about it. So in that context, what we're going to be discussing is, as I've said, how to use a crisis. And as Genevieve said, this is a sort of liminal moment, and the question is how we might emerge, what opportunities there are to re-establish new ways of doing things, ways of really building on the strengths of the past, but to create something which maybe fosters a new normal going forward. The pandemic has really reminded us of the importance of good governance and of capable and appropriately responsive public sector institutions in fulfilling the state's duty of care to its citizens, economy and society. And the discussion that we're going to have is going to develop that. But I must say that I thought the discussion that came from the New South Wales Health people earlier today really was a great indication of the power of a well-resourced, well-thought-out and capable public sector to really step up to the mark in a really profound way. And I found that description that Teresa gave, especially of the way that the organisation of the New South Wales public health sector had actually operated, was just a really powerful model of what might one of the best things that we might take forward. So in this discussion, we're going to talk about that. We'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses that have been revealed by the COVID X-ray, the lessons and new opportunities for reform, and reflect on our capacity to create the sort of society and the future that we want to have going forward. I think the challenge goes beyond recognising the problems and the opportunities. The bigger task is really how to mobilise that collective ability and willingness to act, to address them. The failure to do so will have ramifications for generations, but the right response has the potential to set the country up in a really strong way to look for the future. So this is not a crisis to waste, and the cost of failure could linger for generations. Success could be transformative and set the country up to really thrive. So in starting that, I think you know the biographies of both Anne and Martin. Martin is most recently the head of the Prime Minister's Department and is now Chancellor at Macquarie University, amongst a number of other important roles. And Anne Tiernan, who you can see on the screen, hello Anne, is the Dean of Engagement in the Griffith Business School at Griffith University. She's a member of the board of the Museum of Australian Democracy and occupies a number of other important sort of public policy positions. So I'm going to start by just reading a little quote that comes from Anne Applebaum's terrific new book called Twilight of Democracy. And in it she wrote, "Throughout history, pandemics have led to an expansion of the power of the state. At times when people fear death, they go along with measures that they believe, rightly or wrongly, will save them, even if it means a loss of freedom. In Australia, there was a consensus that people needed to stay at home, that quarantines needed to be enforced, that police needed to play an exceptional role. But in a few places, fear of disease became an inspiration for a whole new generation of authoritarian nationalists. So my opening question to Martin and to Anne is, what has surprised, excited and disappointed you about the Australian response? Martin, I think we'll start with you.
Thanks, Julianne. As someone who lives on Ngunnawal country, allow me to associate myself with a acknowledgement of country that was given by our colleagues earlier, and extend that to people who, from wherever they are around the country, are on Aboriginal land. I think it's worth separating, and I'll focus predominantly on the economic rather than the social issues, just to open up. It's worth separating the economic crisis from the medical crisis that initiated it. If I think about crises, I've always tended to think it's useful to think of three lags. The first is the recognition lag. How long does it take policy makers to realise something is occurring and they need to change course? Then there's a reaction lag or gestation lag. How long does it take them to work out what it is that they should do? And then third, there's a response lag. How long does it take for their actions to begin to have the impact that they're attempting to create? So if I think about the medical dimension of this crisis, I think we were very, very quick to recognise the emergence of the Wuhan, we believe, the Wuhan based virus. And remember, the Australian government closed the border to people from China on the 1st of February, and I think it was about the 3rd or 4th of February before the WHO declared it was a pandemic. I think they were very quick to recognise, they were very quick to react in terms of, and by this I mean both the Commonwealth and the states together as the Federation. They were very quick to react and to put in place policies to settle on an approach of trying to bend the curve, not eliminate. And I think, put Victoria aside for a minute, I think the speed with which the policies they put in place actually had impact was really quite remarkable in the circumstances. And I say put Victoria apart because I think it was inevitable we were going to have a Victoria. It was going to happen somewhere because by the very nature of it, there would be some form of secondary breakout. Now, could Victoria have done better or worse? Clearly it could have done a lot better. We've lost a lot of Australians because of those circumstances. But I think if you think about the medical side, I've been really excited and surprised by how quickly we moved, and also by the reliance on expertise and the trust that the community has put in to the chief medical officers when they've been standing up there. And I put that down to a couple of things, like Shane Fitzsimmons and the other fire chiefs back in December and January. They treated the Australian public like adults. They were open with them, they were transparent with them, they gave them data. And what happens? The public responds by putting trust and faith in those people. And I think that's a lesson our political class needs to take away from this. Treat the public as adults, share with them what the issues are in an open and honest way rather than trying to spin it for short-term political advantage, and ultimately you'll find yourself in a better position. If I think about the economic crisis, it's those same three lags. Very quick to recognise the economic implications. We were designing, we were seeing the public sector designing JobKeeper and JobSeeker within days of recognising what was going on. So that was the recognition of the economic consequences, which were going to be severe, was very quick. The reaction was very quick, and the response to that dimension of it was very quick. Now, there's a separate set of issues which came about with the budget, and I'll come back to those because they're in the disappointment case. I was really pleased to see the embrace of fiscal activism rather than the fixation on the budget surplus. The budget surplus fixation, arguably sensible policy in a different set of circumstances. Circumstances changed, the political class changed. You know, it's that classic thing, why did you change your mind? Well, the facts changed, sir. They did the right thing. So I think, I suppose the other thing is I think the thing that's pleased me is the recognition with Job Seeker that we can't really go back to the sorts of unemployment benefits that we'd had prior to the crisis.
Okay. Now
quickly on the two disappointments.
Let's say the disappointments. We'll bring Anne in on the pleased and surprised and delighted, and we'll wrap up disappointments together. Anne, what's in your group of what excited and surprised you about the Australian response?
Thanks, Julianne, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm from Yagara and Turrbal country on the edge of the Brisbane River here at South Bank. Sorry not to be able to be there. So what surprised me, I work with the public sector every day in different jurisdictions around Australasia. And so I wasn't surprised by the latent capability for innovation, a lot of which I saw Teresa describe earlier in the day. But I was delighted that the rest of the country got to see it and to appreciate that capability and expertise that exists. And, you know, I think about, you know, Martin talked about the speed of the response. I'm really pleased that the X-ray has revealed the kind of hidden wiring that really drives our public policy system, our federation, that Australian Health Principles, Protection Principles Committee. I think none of us knew what the acronym stood for, and I think I just muffed it there too. But you know, that as an incredibly powerful mechanism for insight, early warning, access to data and information, evidence, and projections around the epidemiology of the pandemic. So that has, you know, pleased and surprised me, the level of innovation. Martin referenced the community as co-producers of outcomes in this, and I think that has been extraordinary. And I think it's something that governments often don't think about, the public as co-producers, and I think they've really demonstrated their capacity to do that. I think the other thing that kind of surprised me while it lasted was the big effort that political combatants made to try and put it on a leash. And you could see what a struggle it was, Julianne, but and it lasted for a while through National Cabinet before everybody kind of reverted to their same habits again. So, you know, I'd be keen to come back to a conversation about habits and cultures in terms of what we need to get through the crisis. But I've seen some, you know, amazing things in terms of the cross-sectoral partnerships. Therese alluded to some of that as well in terms of the public and private and community sectors working together. There's been some extraordinary examples of that, and real social innovation, and you know, individual communities kind of stepping up and stepping in to do things and work together. So those, I think, are pretty strong foundations from which to take some lessons from the pandemic.
Okay, that's good. So Martin, let's just flip it now to a couple of the disappointments.
Right, disappointments. I think we have to set two tests for the fiscal stimulus, and we're not in a position to judge yet because arguably we can run through until the May budget next year to see what comes next. But the two tests were really, has the economic response, is it likely to generate jobs and growth in the short term? Arguably, yes. I think absolute pass mark there. You can argue about the composition at the margins, but I think they've done a pretty good job. Second question, much more open-ended. Does the fiscal stimulus, and think about the magnitude of this, we're going to end up with a debt to GDP ratio of heading towards 50% and over $1 trillion worth of debt. So if we're going to spend all that money, does it position us better for the future, either because we're more innovative, we're more productive, or we've set ourselves up to deal with a big problem, e.g. climate change, and to date we haven't seen that money being directed to those sorts of issues. Second issue is that the composition of the stimulus to date has been what I would say as akin to fighting the recession of the early 90s. It's gone to areas, predominantly gone to areas where the professions or the occupations are predominantly male-dominated. And yet the initial hit, and I say initial because this will change over time, the initial hit has been on areas dominated by women and young workers, and so there will be very long-term consequences on the gender wage gap, the difference between male and female superannuation balances, and if you're starting out in the job market today, you're likely to have lower lifetime earnings than if you'd started out even just a couple of years ago.
So, Anne, before I go to you, I just want to follow through this a little bit with Martin. So you've been in those very senior jobs in Treasury and climate change and Prime Minister and Cabinet. Throughout most of your career, money's been tight. It's been about balanced budgets. It's about, no new policy that you have to have new money for, essentially. So all of a sudden, there is lots of money. Money's not the problem. How, and I'm not asking you to criticise those who've succeeded you in the roles, but I'm just wondering how in that environment, the sort of Treasury, Prime Minister Cabinet Office environment, could you have argued for different outcomes along the lines that you're suggesting? I mean, you're saying that in a way the budget response has addressed a short-term problem rather than set it up for a longer-term outcome.
Yeah, look, I don't want to be critical because you're in the midst of a crisis, and so often in the midst of a crisis, your horizon is really close to your face. And so going for the traditional instruments is it's not an unusual response. But given that this was the first budget ever to be put together without a budget constraint, right? I mean, once you decided it didn't matter whether we were going to have a $150 billion deficit or a $200 billion deficit or a $250 billion deficit, and it didn't, because once you're in those ballparks, we're talking, the economic differential in the long term is neither here nor there. I would have liked to have seen a real clear focus on how does this set Australia up for the future, and that could have been fostering innovation, accelerating digitisation and automation, or encouraging, and there's been a little bit of this, so I'm not saying there's none, but encouraging faster response in climate change space, or modern manufacturing, or fill in whatever it is that you're most interested in. And I'd say the third, third disappointment has been the revealed attitude towards the higher education sector. So it's not just the creative arts.
Yeah, the education is a crucial one. So and I'm going to come to you in a second, but I just want to follow this through for a few minutes. So when you say that when you're in a crisis, you deal with what you've got in front of you, and that's obvious, but then obviously this is something which is completely different, so the ballpark changes. And I'm just interested in the process by which the advice that becomes available, and that you draw on in those roles, that in a way the limitation of that, and I say this in the context of the Royal Society and the 4 academies, where there are very different disciplinary bases. There are people who come at these big problems from all sorts of different disciplines. Seems to me that the advice that filters through to Canberra now and has done for a long time comes from a very much narrower base than you would get if, for instance, you drew on the full range of sort of intellectual resources from the humanities, the sciences, the technology sciences and so on. And I wonder whether that's part of the problem in terms of the thinking being short, that the frame is a bit too narrow.
No, I actually disagree with the premise. You're getting advice from the social welfare departments, so from the health department, from human services, from social security. You're getting advice from the industry department, we've had a national innovation strategy, but hasn't gone very far. We've had a digital economy strategy, hasn't gone very far. The reason these things haven't gone very far is because the political process hasn't wanted to pick them up and run with them.
Okay.
Now, you can understand why they may have prioritised against doing that in a world where the budget constraint is binding, but in a world where all of a sudden the budget constraint is no longer binding, you would really have hoped that there'd been a much greater focus on those long-term things. Now, I'm quite confident that, because I know the people who have done this work, I'm quite confident that governments, and I say this both Commonwealth and state, have received that advice. And you can see it overseas. Look at the difference in the composition of our fiscal response and that of some of the Europeans, where the Germans alone have put a massive amount of money in to accelerate the transition to a more hydrogen-based economy. They've really focused on how do we, not just Germans, Europeans more generally, they've really focused on how do we actually position ourselves better to succeed in a low emissions world as we come out of this. Who knows who wins the US presidency? But Biden's been quite clear if he were to win, he'd be drawing on similar elements, and in a way we look like the odd one out in that we haven't done much in that space. But it's not the case we haven't done anything. We have, because we've put a little money into the technology roadmap, and we've put some sensible investment into improving the transmission links. But we could have done a lot more and positioned ourselves a lot better. But to do that, you would have had to have changed your language about your narrative about coal. You would have had to have changed your narrative about when are we going to aim for net zero by
2050.
Insert what year you want.
Okay, thank you. So, Anne, two things. You might want to respond to what Martin's just said and then come back to your disappointments, or the other way around, but you've got to...
Well, look, my disappointments would be not dissimilar to the line of questioning that you pursued with Martin, really, Julianne, is the sort of the personalisation and narrowing of the advisory arrangements. And the National COVID Commission is sort of one example. The kind of the limited thought diversity of the people who were drawn in to these different commissions and task forces and so on, and then the sort of the stubborn resistance to contestability or scrutiny and accountability of those bodies. So, Martin's got, understandable confidence in the capacity of the APS, and, as I do too, I think it would have been really nice to have some lived experience from people in lots of different places, instead of people suddenly being surprised that aged care homes were really vulnerable and in shocking shape. The only people who didn't seem to know that were the minister, at Senate estimates when he got asked about it. So, there's a bunch of vulnerabilities that to me everybody knew were problems, and what's disappointing is the extent to which it's been impenetrable. Now, Martin points, rightly to the lack of effective demand for advice that's not kind of consistent with preferred ways forward, but that there is so little in these stimulus programs and support programs for women, I think, is scandalous, and for young people, I think, is similarly. And I'm not as good-natured as Martin is, and I really agree about, just the extraordinary way the higher education sector has been dealt with in terms of you're actually serious about setting up the country for knowledge and skills, for an economy profoundly disrupted, for reshoring and other kind of opportunities that might exist at the place level to create prosperity in lots of different parts of the country that hasn't enjoyed it over the last period of time, then those are very short-sighted strategies. And there's something about the architecture of our advisory arrangements and how vulnerable they are to the whims of political leaders of whatever colour, in order to filter out anything they don't want to hear. So I think, to some extent, the success of the public health response, might be masking some of those problems, and everybody's, there's a lot of goodwill to go around at the moment, but I think there's, real questions to be asked as we get to March. And I suppose my other disappointment, sort of speaking to that, is the extent to which these kinds of tropes of, people have lost their jobs through no fault of their own, because people previously lost their jobs through some fault of theirs. So I think there's a bunch of things, that I still don't like in the discourse, that I think will really come to a head if we get to March and job seeker. There's an attempt to put job seeker back to where it was at the New Start level, which is just wholly inadequate, and a whole bunch of questions about very fragmented, damaged delivery systems, aged care just being one of the most spectacular, and what will be the ways in which those will be dealt with. Will it be similarly piecemeal, I guess, is what would be my concern.
So there's a strong contrast, isn't there? I mean, if we're thinking about forward-looking, the importance of the education sector is obviously crucial in that. And there's a very strong contrast, I think, between the resources, the capacity and so on that have been thrown at the health system and the research community, the medical research community. By contrast, I'm just interested to try, and I'm sure everyone in this room is, dealing with this one way or another in terms of the cuts to the universities and the, huge numbers of people that we're seeing lose their jobs and the lack of opportunities for young academics, as well as the increased costs for young students. I'm just interested in the sort of how important and how damaging you think that targeting of education has been in terms of this creating a new future. If we're creating a new normal, what do you think the consequences of it might be? And I guess in a way, maybe you have some insights into where it's come from.
If I've got any insights, they'll stay with me. But look, I think there was a view in parts of the political process and in parts of the business community that universities, I'm not saying this is right, but there's a view, were fat, they had big reserves, they were profligate, and they indulged in a whole pile of research in inverted commas that was going to do nothing about helping Australia's future. And to be frank, I suspect that part of the response has been opportunistic, that this is because of the departure of international students, this is a chance to put the screws on the universities and force them to actually engage more with business, force them to get more efficient. I don't actually disagree that much of the university sector is actually inefficient, but I also don't disagree with the argument that the university sector has taken on a lot of risk with the way it's become to rely on international students, and particularly international students from China. My response is, under both coalition government and Labor government, these have been the incentives that governments have put in place for universities to respond to. And yes, you don't like the outcome, well, congratulate the universities for acting rationally in response to the incentives you put there. If you didn't like that outcome, you should not have put those incentives there, and please don't tell us that you didn't know this was the obvious outcome, because you've been told, and you've been told time and time again. The flip side is, I think the university sector is absolutely, utterly hopeless at engaging with government as a sector, not individual universities. Some are very good, but as a sector, as hopeless engaging with government, it's got an incredible sense of entitlement, and frankly, there have been parts of the universities which have looked down their nose on engaging with business because that's all a bit dirty and beneath them. And I think, one of the things that will come out of this, we have imperilled a $38 billion a year export industry, which is our third largest. Well, that's been imperilled. I can't undo what's been done there. But what I can do as a Chancellor and work with other Vice-Chancellors and other Chancellors and people like my Dean, Eric here, is to try and drive better engagement with government so government has a better appreciation of what universities are actually doing, a better appreciation of the community and better appreciation and engagement with business and community groups.
And you're very involved in that business engagement through Griffith University. What's your sort of take on all of this?
Yeah, look, I really agree with Martin on both sides of that debate. I don't think universities have always been very good at doing those kinds of things. And I think the other thing I'd kind of point to, Julianne, is that the federal government has seemed incredibly surprised that it was in charge of higher education policy and has shaped these incentives and outcomes in lots of ways. But I think actually state governments have been a bit MIA in some of that stuff too. So there's no real policy home for thinking about the universities as platforms for economic activity, and I just mean in terms of their sheer size, resources, capability, what big employers they are, what big purchasers they are. So I think I'm naturally working in the engagement space at a university that was set up to be an engaged one and has a proud tradition of doing that. But at times the times didn't suit us. That seemed like not where we needed to be heading. So I'm pleased that sort of stayed the way it is at Griffith in lots of ways. But I don't know that state governments and the universities and local governments, frankly, have thought enough about the ways in which, if they aligned their procurement, if they thought about their local workforce strategies, they could come together as anchor institutions to really shape some fantastic outcomes. So that's a lot of the work that we're quite interested in doing. I know a number of other Australian universities are interested in doing that too. That seems to be understood by local federal MPs. So I guess the unis just have to get better at that. I'm really worried about the loss of talent at the very precarious early years of academic careers, and it's a talented young researcher. The volume of those that will be lost in the period ahead is just quite tragic, and you can't just flick the switch and bring those kinds of careers back, unfortunately.
Can I just add to that? Look, I agree totally with Anne. That's where the big risk is. The one thing is the sector's got to stop complaining about the situation we're in. We're in it. We can't undo that. So now we've got to make the very best of it. And that means actually stepping up and doing things and being more innovative and taking risks and moving out of our comfort zone. In that respect, we're no different to any other part of the community in the way it's going to have to respond to this new environment.
It's very interesting because I'm sure you're both right, in your analysis. I don't quibble with it at all. But it does strike me that there is something particular about education, as indeed with the sort of cultural sector that we've been talking about. Education, for whatever the inefficiencies and arrogance and what have you of individual universities or individual universities as a group, I mean, they have objectively succeeded. The incentives were given, or funding was reduced. They responded rationally, created a market, as has so many other sectors. The export market that's grown primarily with China across all sectors of Australian industry. They've responded in that way. They've made a business. Just as in the creative and cultural areas, people have made businesses. They've made businesses which have been quite successful and have sustained a sector. What I think has taken people both in education and in the cultural space by surprise is that at the base of both education and culture is a sort of purpose. You know, the purpose is about building capacity. It's about giving meaning. It's about, you know, it's the meaning-making space in a way of an activity. And so I think it's particularly striking that the two sectors which have been most directly affected by political decisions in this round have been the ones which have been in that space of making meaning and having a purpose. Reflecting back on what Peter was saying this morning about the professors walking around and discovering the sort of treatments to the, or ways of dealing with the early pandemics and diseases in the colonies, you know, there was the university professor as a sort of an adjunct of the purpose of the state. And what we're now seeing in both of these areas is somehow that purpose bit has been cut off in a sort of a consideration of financial and other decisions that means they don't exist, even though they've also been playing in the economic space that they've been told to. I don't know, it's just an observation.
No, I think it's actually a good observation. I won't talk about the creative sectors, but I think the universities in part lost sight of their role of purpose and stopped articulating it. I think there's a presumption. I'll be blunt. Don't you know how important my work is? Therefore, the Australian taxpayer should fund me. Well, actually, the person who's sitting at Mount Druitt earning minimum wage and living in crappy housing, why should I, as a politician, prioritise giving money to you when I could equally be giving it to improve their health, their education, or their housing experience?
But we're not in a zero-sum game anymore.
Well, no.
I was going to say they didn't really do that either, Martin.
No. I'm not saying that is the way they've thought about it. But if we want to win that argument, we've actually got to get back out there and explain purpose.
Yep.
And saying our purpose is to educate people to go into jobs. Well, no, that's an element of it. Our purpose is to educate people to be good citizens, but at some point there's got to be an economic dimension to it. So how do you actually think about those economic dimensions? And that's got to come back to engagement of the academy with business. Now, I think the medical research side of the higher education sector has done that so much better than other parts of the universities. Interestingly, you don't see that degree of tension when it comes to funding medical research. But you do see it when it comes to other areas. And the more you go into the humanities space, that tension becomes sharper and sharper. And I think that is because it has become almost fashionable for both ends of this debate to sit there and throw rocks at one another and not try and find a common ground. It's too easy. The two camps are entrenched, and coming out and trying to find a middle ground requires effort, and neither side's been willing to do it.
I want to say something, but Anne, I'll let you go first.
Well, I was going to say, I think, I'm always sort of bemused. I don't disagree with Martin that, I think universities need to work harder to articulate their purpose. And I think you don't see the kinds of collaborations that are, or joint appointments or embedded activity that the medical research and training sort of allows in other parts of the universities. But I must say, a lot of the culture war, which is framed through the student politics experience of the very narrow group of people in Parliament or in Cabinet, who to tell these stories of the great wars they fought on campuses. That's not the reality at my university. Students don't have time to be doing that stuff. That was a luxury that the hyper-partisans were learning so that they could progress through the ministerial staff system to become ministers themselves. It's just diluted. that's what's happening on university campuses. But it is a very entrenched view, and not, when we were framing this session, one of the things we didn't want to do was admire the problem too much. So it absolutely is a problem. And I think it is really incumbent on all of us to sort of see if we can find a way past it through articulating purpose. And, and I think that is a massive opportunity. What we're seeing now in terms of the public health capacity, in terms of the testing regimes and capacity, is all about partnerships that were forged between government, business, the health systems over a long period of time. And, every crisis this country has ever had where we found a solution and a way out of it was multi-sectoral in its dimensions. And if we're talking about post-war reconstruction, or we're talking about, modernising Australia through the 1980s and 90s in economic reform, academics and researchers were really important part and players in that, and so were business and other players with politics and with the public service. So, then this is why I'm so worried about the narrowing of these advisory structures, because it's just too selective and you can filter out anybody you don't want to hear. And that's evident in the packages that we can see.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you think back to the sort of the founding principles that guided the growth of the universities. I mean, it was about the nation being more than a firm, so it was about building the capacity across the board. So, I mean, when you talk, for instance, of the family at Mount Druitt struggling to, hold body and soul together, the data shows that people in those households, their aspiration for their kids is that they are not there, that they get opportunity to get an education that opens other doors for them, through the place. You see that in the sort of the surveys that's done of the mining communities in central Queensland, that they don't actually want their kids to be working in the mining industry. They don't see that as something that's got a long-term future. They want the pathways that broaden it out. So I think that the sort of polarity that has developed between good doctors and bad humanities people, which is sort of we're all sort of vaguely aware of. I mean, of course doctors are good. That's why they take a Hippocratic oath. They can save us. They have the power of life and death. It is the unique proposition that attaches to medicine. So it sits on its own pedestal. The notion that by drawing on the resources of history, of philosophy, of religion, of studies of the humanities to actually inform the richness of the human response, that somehow or other that's of less value in the sustaining of a human life. Well, in the short term, yes, you're not going to give me the drugs. The longer term, probably not. It's going to be that extra thing that's going to make the difference.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all. And I think Anne touched on a key part of the problem, which is, and I'm on the public record, I've said this before, I think our political class has been narrowed. Just look at the experience set of people now, compare them back to, say, the Hawke-Keating, the Hawke government of 83, or go back even further. And just see the more disparate sets of experiences. Too often now, kids go to university, they play university politics, and what do we know about that? It's the old Henry Kissinger thing. The reason why it's so vicious is because the stakes are so small. They learn winner-take-all approaches, and they parlay that into a junior advisor's job, an electorate officer job, and they become an advisor or a senior advisor, and they parlay that eventually into some sort of pathway that, and they might have a few other steps out and about, typically into a law firm or, something similar. Government relations, or if on the Labor side they've gone into the unions and then they come back. But they've learnt a set of behaviours when they were more formative, which they then carry through into national politics. The other thing I'd say is that what we've seen in the last 15 years or so has been the injection of behaviours that have been, unfortunately, have become more common in state politics in Australia into the federal scene. And those two things, I think, are quite corrosive for us. Anyway, I think Well, that's interesting. We're digressing.
So in terms of, but that does raise the question. I mean, in terms of thinking about where the new opportunities might lie, I mean, if this is a genuinely transformative moment, you know, like the Great Depression or like the end of the Second World War, if you were trying to think, well, what are the opportunities? How might you go about imagining a restructuring, a reshaping? Where do you want to be? I mean, a couple of questions. One, what might that look like? But a sort of prior question in a way is, where would you begin to have that conversation? Apart from here.
Do you want to start with that?
Anne? Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, I would hope, you know, there's been a bit of talk about the Federation and, you know, how well or otherwise the Federation has performed in the crisis. I think there's a whole series of questions that, you know, relate to decentralisation, devolution of responsibility, recognition of the subsidiarity principle. You know, what we know is that Australia is diverse and becoming more diverse. And to accommodate that diversity and difference was why we've got the design that we've got. But we need to find ways of tapping local knowledge and insight in the way that the pandemic has revealed that we need to do. We need to normalise and institutionalise that, and that's pushing against sort of 30 years of centralisation backed up by, you know, the vertical fiscal imbalance. And so I think a bit more, I mean, one of the things, Julianne, that we haven't had a chance to talk about is the role of essential workers in this crisis and how, you know, the roles of people doing that really important work needs to be valued going forward. Now, those are the people who work for state and local governments often who are performing those kinds of roles. There's frontline roles in federal government too, of course. I'm not suggesting they're not, but I do think there is something about getting power and responsibility and opportunity and capacity out into the different and diverse parts of the country. And that will be a big shift of habits and cultures. But I think people can see that their community, that how things have been organised, their level has been really important. So how do we sustain that? What are the mechanisms we can put in place to sustain that rather than going back to business as usual? And, you know, we haven't got time to kind of talk about the National Cabinet and, you know, what might be good about that, but also what might be weakening about that as well. So, you know, I think it's all about subsidiarity, non-absorption, putting things back out, and keeping these communities, their willingness to be co-producers. You know, we talked about data and insight about what's going on the ground and being able to match those things up in terms of local action. You know, everywhere that the pandemic is being handled badly, there's not enough local capacity. There's too much trying to be done from the centre, as in, you know, the UK, the classic example. So I really do think we need to think about the partnerships that exist in different places to accommodate the very different needs that have been exposed and have probably been there all along.
Yeah, just to add to that, the data that's available and the technology now allows you to move away from one-size-fits-all approaches. And if we're really serious, people have talked about it for years, citizen-centric design. Well, if we're really serious about it, we've now got the data, we've got the technology to deliver it, and the circumstances are sufficiently different geographically and across different cultural groups, across different socioeconomic groups. We should actually start putting much more emphasis on pilots and you know, fail fast. Have a go, fail fast. The problem is our whole culture in Australia is if you fail, then forever you've got a big black mark on your forehead. Contrast that to the US as an entrepreneur. If you try something and you fail, and then you can try something again, the first thing people ask is, what did you learn from your failure? Whereas in Australia, the response is, well, why would we? You failed once. Why would we want to back a loser? That cultural dimension is pretty important.
The other side of that, I think you're absolutely right, but the other side of that is that we have perpetual trials. We have short-term grants, we have systems things that are put out. People do something, they get it up, they do it. They don't get it to a sustainable practice, but they get it to the point where it's almost ready to go, and it stops. And then nothing goes, blah, 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 a few years later, let's do a trial in this area again. I mean, in my own experience, can probably count, a couple of dozen examples where that's happened, where things have been done as a trial.
Yeah,
they
I really
haven't
agree
failed.
with that, Julianne.
They haven't failed, but they've never gone anywhere.
I couldn't agree more, and that's particularly acute in Indigenous affairs. The flip side, though, is the experience of NDIS. So, National Disability Insurance Scheme that was set up, there was going to be a series of trials, geographic areas, we were going to do different things, we were going to learn, we were going to make sure that because we absorb those lessons and then we'd roll it out and it would work much better. What happened? As we started these, people here were saying, hang on, that person there's getting something I'm not getting, that's not fair. The political class put all the pressure on then to actually go from abandon the trials, abandon the let's learn where the problems are going to come about and jump immediately to trying to offer it to everybody. That's fine if you can actually provide the supply. But part of what the trial was about was how do you actually build out the supply of resources and facilities to match what will be the growing demand. And so again, as citizens, our impatience and our sense of equity was being insulted.
And a noisy public response.
A noisy public response.
Noisy and ill-informed public response.
Yeah, exactly. But so much of what happens now is politicians hear the megaphone, but they don't know how many people are yelling into the megaphone. And more often than not, it's a very small number of people who are yelling into that megaphone, and so they're responding to... social media is the prime example here. If you look in the climate change space, the proportion of people who really utterly disbelieve the science, absolute, you'll never be able to change their mind about anything, is minuscule. I mean, it might get to 10% of the population, but they're disproportionately influential in the media, and in particular parts of the media which are influential with the political
in a shrunken media, in our very shrunken media. So Anne, would you say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, I really agree with that, right? There are these tensions between the expectation of universality and sameness and equity and, accommodating different requirements sort of in place. But I think, I'm really interested in the potential to be aggregating capacity and resources at the place level or sort of closer to where people are from the different sectors. And I always get really frustrated when what doesn't matter what tier of government it is, but decides to open a new office. I think we've got to, why don't you do that and, have a boundary that overlaps somebody else's and doesn't align. I actually think there's a lot of scope, and maybe this is a role for universities, Martin, in terms of thinking about aggregating local capacity as a platform from which to do a variety of things off a shared, information base with a good understanding of the local context and trying to build local capacity to do that. What I'm worried about is that, there'll be, these cycles of fashions of, it'll be all about place or it'll be all about this, and then there'll be turnover and churn and the institutional memory of what's happened before will be gone, and, there's no history. And people will want to start again. So I think it's really incumbent on citizens and, people who've thought quite hard about the experience and what the pandemic has kind of taught them to be thinking about demanding these kinds of things from decision makers. And, we've got a lot of unfinished business, don't we, in terms of reforming the Constitution, local government recognition, the Uluru Statement. There's the Republic debate that many people are kind of keen to reanimate, particularly now that we know that Will's, tested positive to COVID-19. There's a whole bunch of kind of issues that we need to talk about as a nation. What's the catalytic opportunity to do that in a way that isn't divisive, that is inclusive and doesn't, break up into the usual camps?
So can I just back that in? I think one of the great things about the changes in the closing the gap strategy has been the emphasis on place. We've been trying to edge up to that, and localised data and people on the ground being able to actually play a key role in determining what needs to be done is absolutely central. But if we come back to the question of COVID and its impact more broadly, one of the things that's really interesting, and to me it's a two-edged sword, is the whole phenomenon of working from home. So working from home I can see could have some real benefits. It's about localism, it's about strengthening community. You know, you live, you work, you participate in the community, you have your children educated, you're whatever, all in a geographically constrained area. That could be really good for mental health and social cohesion and a whole variety of things. But the social cohesion could well be at a micro level, and the macro social cohesion could be eroded because I'm spending more and more time with, you know, if I've self-selected into a place where it looks like, you know, everybody who's there looks like me. Equally, if you think about working from home, there's going to then be some really big implications for how we do housing design, how we think about the risk shift and the cost shift. So the risk shift is the OH&S risk is now sitting at home with you. The cost shift is the electricity and heating and the like that the employer used to provide is sitting at home with you. So what does that then say in terms of compensation arrangements? Do firms...
The care shift.
The care, and then there's the other thing is, does working from home simply mean that women end up taking on even more of the domestic duties than they do now? The other thing in all of this is to remember that working from home is a white-collar phenomenon. Yep, it might impact on all of us, and it could be advantageous or it could be disadvantageous, but if I'm a blue-collar worker or if I'm in the personal services sector, I've still got to go to the building site or the factory or the cafe or wherever. I'm not getting the benefit of that. And so it's not to me the panacea people are presenting it at.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something there, Anne? No,
I was just really agreeing that I think that's right. And I think there's a lot of potentially stranded assets too, right, in CBDs and and built up areas. So I think there's a lot of concern about that as well.
We're going to do some questions, or?
I think we've come to time. So maybe...
Oh, sorry, I thought you wanted me to go on and then.
No, that's fine.
So.
Last round of conversation on the panel.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, right. So what will we do as our last topic? We have many left here. I think that. One of the things, just pulling together a couple of the comments that you were making earlier, I mean, I think we've all reason to feel quite proud of the way Australia has responded to this. I mean, I think the way individual citizens have responded, as a community, how we responded. I mean, I think it's actually been a pretty exemplary set of behaviours over a pretty trying time. And so that level of trust, I think, is quite high. And I guess the question is, in a way, of how that level of trust can be maintained and built on to do this, creating something better in what is going to be a very volatile global environment. I mean, we're looking at a situation with China that is sort of, where it looks like Australia could well be the demonstration project of China's power. Who knows what's going to happen in the US with the outcome of the election there? Europe's very fragile. Britain's, no longer able to provide us with meaningful guidance. I just wonder, we've demonstrated that the community is resilient, that it's got trust, it's got capacity, and it's willing to actually, take that extra step. How do we play that out in a global environment where our normal sources of guidance and advice are not really looking like places you want to take a lot of guidance and advice from, and where it is much more volatile? That's before you start adding in climate change and the other sort of things which are going to be profoundly destabilising. How do you see this playing out in that sort of global context? We've got some good, but how do we measure it up?
Yeah, this is one of those things where I think we and a handful of other countries have the opportunity to improve our domestic operations, if you will, because of the way in which you handle it. And I think in terms of Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, right? And go back to the chart that was up. You know, the Asia Pacific looks like a blip compared to the failures of Europe and the United States. I think the thing that's going to be, I think there are two things we have to think about. One, internationally, is any coordination on challenges of the global commons is going to be harder going forward than it has been in the past. You started off with what excited and surprised and what disappointed. What I should have said in the disappointed space is this is the first crisis I have seen in my lifetime where there has not been some attempt at a coordinated or, if not coordinated, at least collaborative global response. Think about SARS, MERS, H1N1, think about Ebola, think about the GFC and the role that, you know, okay, we've probably glossed up a bit on Australia's role, but we played a pretty important role. Think about the G7 and the role it played back, you know, go back to the recessions of decades earlier. Yet there's been no international response. Yes, scientists have worked together, medical researchers have worked together, businesses have worked together, but states have not. And that's a reflection of two things. One, the United States not being prepared any longer to pay the price of global leadership or global coordination. It created the system and it no longer believes, or at least its current leadership no longer believes that it's getting a fair return from that investment. And then you've got a China which is unwilling to lead, is incapable of leading, and then you've got a whole pile of other players who are big enough to be disruptive but not big enough to step in and replace that US coordination role. So I think the multilateral system, I've said this elsewhere, and here I'm really channeling my friend Alan Gingell, the international order is no longer under threat. The international order is gone, it's destroyed. And the question is, how is that going to constrain Australia's ability to take decisions around trade, economic investment decisions, migration decisions, foreign investment policy, national security? We are going to be in a world where this is the most contested part of the world, and we're going to spend more on national security. And to the extent that we're going into this with much higher debt, that's going to put real pressure on our ability to spend in other areas. The second thing, which coming back to the domestic issue, is economists love to talk about the concept of creative destruction. One of the things that happens in a recession is you wipe out a lot of inefficient firms and in your classical economics model, those workers immediately transform into other jobs that have magically appeared. We know the world doesn't work like that, never did. You run the risk of, as you withdraw either the stimulus or the job seeker, you risk throwing people onto the scrap heap too early if the economy hasn't yet picked up enough to be able to begin to generate jobs that will absorb those people. How we navigate that and the tension of having to sort of wind back fiscal stimulus is going to be really, really difficult. The one thing is there's no inflation on the horizon, and I can't see in the foreseeable future, and by that I mean many, many years, inflation being a problem. So it does allow the central banks globally to focus on keeping interest rates low, and that means that we can fund the fiscal stimulus that's been injected globally. But what it does mean is that we're going to need to find new instruments. And so where there are pockets of pressures emerging, we're going to have to rely much more on regulatory and particularly macro-prudential instruments. And that's not been a space which we've been particularly comfortable in historically. So I think they're two interesting perspectives.
Anne?
Yeah, well, I'd really agree with all of that. But, at the same time, we've totally divested our investment in our diplomatic capacities. So we're carrying big diplomatic deficits. That doesn't seem like a very smart thing to have done in terms of, a time that's so dangerous and difficult and requires really good insight. I think the opportunity of the climate transition, the transition to low carbon, is one that is being embraced. Even in the absence of sort of any coherent national policy leadership. And Paul Martin has had to endure having done all that proactive work and having things in place only to have them dismantled through the cycle. But I think we'll see a lot more subnational collaboration around some of that stuff. I mean, the New South Wales government is doing some really aggressive work on decarbonising the economy. I think everybody's wishing the Queensland government would do that, particularly in light of the Deloitte report that came up on Monday that sort of showed that 70% of the new jobs will be created here, or otherwise, it'll just be a complete disaster. So I think there's I think the way policy gets catalysed and the way some of these shifts are made will be a lot less centred than they have been in the past. They'll have to be, because we can't endure another wasted decade of reform. It's just too dangerous. So, one hopes that the capabilities around smart regulation or some of these other, skills that we haven't necessarily maintained can be activated quickly. But yeah, I mean, there's a number of areas of policy where we may not have what we need. And so how do governments partner with other sectors in order to get where we need to go? And citizens just really need to be making that demand. I think on the social cohesion kind of front, I was thinking, Martin, while you were talking, like the generational divides and some of the reports we're seeing of how pessimistic young people are about their prospects are really very concerning. I would hope that, just as Australia was a democratic innovator back in the at the turn of the century, we might be able to leverage off. We might be able to kind of get off our humility wagon and sort of hold ourselves up as a bit of a beacon, but we'd have to hold ourselves to some high standards. But I do think the fundamentals are there, and I think the holding centre of Australian politics has been so clear. Unemployment will really strain that. And particularly in parts of regional Australia, where it's not implausible that, right-wing extremist groups and other groups become very disenfranchised, and it doesn't take that many. And it's not like the Scanlon survey isn't showing at least some of that already, even if it's modest, and it doesn't take much. And people need to just feel like they've got a stake and need to be involved, and that's what this country always did so well. That seems to me to be the big policy opportunity.
Well, thank you both very much. I mean, I think you've thrown down some really valuable new big ideas for Australia. So hopefully this is just the beginning of an ongoing conversation. Thank you.